everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Analysis with Ro. I am your host, Ro, giving you the latest when it comes to either analyzations or updates on your favorite fiction. We are still analyzing Hunter x Hunter. So, diving back into the economic section of what we talked about last time. On the last time for this mini-series, we talked about essentially Hisoillu, aka Hisoka, and Illumi's prenup. And the main reason we talked about that prenup was because it was mentioned within, a special chapter I like to nickname the engagement announcement chapter. So for that chapter, it was like, ooh, prenup. And pretty much a lot of people have been asking, what the hell was a prenup? So that last episode, in case you haven't caught it, it literally is in the title. It's when I was talking all about prenups and what was included. What I did not include last time, but I will today, and what we will be discussing today, is the more so specific portions of what a prenup talks about, because prenups, more so allude towards the economic portion of a marriage, right? So the economic benefits of a marriage and what needs to be talked about with the divisions of, all of that is monetary. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that, and the very first step is figuring things out, like salaries, assets, the whole nine. So, our very first step into that regard is the first explanation. What is an asset? Before we dive into anything else, we need to know what an asset is. So, for part one, what is an asset? Assets are a key component that prenuptial agreements include. But what exactly is it? You are asking. To answer your question, an asset is a probable economic benefit obtained or controlled by a particular entity as a result of past transactions. So to put it into layman's terms, essentially, think of anything that might essentially be economically beneficial for you. This is included but not limited to when you think assets. And I believe this is most of the time with TV too. When they talk assets, they're talking things like, a house is an asset. So property, that's a form of an asset. And that's probably the most common one that you have heard about. Well, today we're going to dive into a little bit more than just property assets, but that's probably the most common one that you're thinking of. What will be financially beneficial for you long term is typically what assets, normally refer to. So, now that we've established that, let's see how that applies to essentially Illumi and his fiancée. Also, another note, we won't be talking about everything and anything that dives into their economics in this section. This is basically the cutoff. We will continue the economic section on Hisoka's end when we get to his analysis. So just know that just because it would be like, oh, there should be like more, talking about the economics of their marriage and what, comes into marriage in speaking in terms of, again, economics and money and all those alignments. We'll talk more about that on Hisoka's end, given that he's the one that basically had the prenup created, if you will. He's the one that prompted the idea. Put it simply, so if that's the case, it's more on his end. So we'll talk way more about, first of all, divisions of maybe, the checks and stuff. We'll talk more so about how everything is divided. Do they combine accounts in general, things like that. It's going to be more so on his end. So let us dive into what an asset even is. So now that we had a basic introduction into what we're going to talk about today, which is essentially salaries and assets, the first thing that we need to know is what even is an asset. So, assets are a key component that the prenuptial agreement is definitely going to include. But you're probably wondering, what the hell is it? What are we talking about? Here, I'm going to clarify. An asset is the probable economic benefits obtained or controlled by a particular entity as a result of past transactions. Basically, anything that you basically own that might be economically beneficial to you is an asset. Say you got like this old vintage piece of jewelry from like the 1800s. That's an asset. Or your house, right? And your house eventually either gains or loses value over time. That's an asset. So anything that essentially could gain value over time and could eventually be economically beneficial, and not even just over time, because like even with short-term assets, which we will also get into, just anything that's economically beneficial to you is an asset. So now that we established what an asset is and the basics of it, let us dive deeper into how this applies to Illumi and his fiancée. All right. So the types of assets that we are going to be talking about today. So before we get into the specifics of what assets this couple may have in their prenuptial agreement, let us also dive into the various types of assets. The two categories that assets fit into are current assets and non-current assets. So, current assets are those that can be converted into cash, while non-current assets are long-term assets that are difficult to convert into cash. So, some examples of current assets include the following: cash, account receivables, inventory, which are goods to sell, prepayments, and short-term investments, which are stocks and shares. Non-current assets include long-term investments and tangible assets such as land and buildings, and intangible assets such as copyrights. So, that is basically the definition of what an asset is, along with all the specifics of the types of assets that we are going to talk about. I'm going to take a very quick break, and then when we get back, we're going to talk more about how this pertains to their prenup. Welcome back, everybody. All right, let's continue on, shall we? So, now in their prenup, it states that in the case of death, all of Hisoka's assets will belong to Illumi. So that's essentially what the prenup mentioned and talked about. And to get a good picture of what they might look like, let's look into some of the assets that Hisoka might have, starting with his salary rates for the cash asset portion. Basically, before I continue on, we are going to be diving into a whole lot of numbers and math. So if you feel the need to maybe grab a notebook to catch up, I completely get it. Because me doing the research for this entire time took so long, and I'm not even done because I said that we're going to continue on even more speaking about the economics behind their relationship when we get to his other half, aka his fiance. So when we get to Hisoka's analysis, it's going to be more so part, I believe, like 3 and 4 for this entire series. So part 1 and 2 is on Illumi's end, and part 3 and 4 is going to be on Hisoka's end. So, let us get into the numbers, shall we? So for an athlete of his caliber, because that is the best job translation into the real world of what he would have, his pay range would be around 500,000 to 3 million. So that's the pay range. So to earn money, typically a fighter will basically have contracts. So a fighter has contract pay. So I think that would be considered in the category of an independent contractor. So typically they sign a contract that is binding for a set number of fights, and they pay a fixed amount each time that they fight. So that's typically how their salary is set. So a fighter's income is also heavily influenced by his or her popularity and performance, as these factors increase the possibility of receiving bonuses based on the outcomes of the fight. And the reason why I analyzed it in this way is because honestly the best translation to what his job would be in the real world is an MMA fighter. So I basically took upon that analysis into mind. It was like, okay, that is literally the best translation. So let's look into how athletes are paid, and that's where all this came from. So Hisoka has a high popularity rating as well as a better chance of attracting other opportunities. As we know, he's a very popular fighter within the Heavens Arena. So other things to consider is sponsorships as well. So he has a very high popularity rating, better chance of attracting other opportunities, sponsorships being the main one. So that makes him a relatively wealthy fighter. So with all of this in mind, the assets that appear most important to him may be things like cash, copyrights, and inventory for merchandise. In other words, current assets. So fighters with 21 or more bouts, that's how it's measured, earn approximately $21,000 per appearance in sponsorships, with the bonus of $50,000 for fights of the night, which are special fighting events. So all of this is going to be taken account for his current assets. His non-current assets, which will probably include his penthouse, copyrights to any of the merchandise he might have, and any potential charities that his agents recommend investing into. So those are everything that applies when it comes to Hisoka's salary and assets. Now that we got all that down and we understand Hisoka's assets, let us dive into Illumi's assets, because that's important too. So, Illumi's salary is also heavily dependent on contracts. So they're both independent contract workers, in which he would earn approximately $15 million or more per assassination. Because I also did research about assassination pay, which was very interesting. So, Illumi would also probably have to cut a certain percentage to go into the family business, with that percentage approximately equaling to 20%. And the reason why I said this is typically, for example, with independent contracting, let's say with modeling, you work for a certain agency, right? So you have this job and that's great. What would happen is you would get 80% of the money and 20% would go to your agents. I believe it's the same way, right? For each and every single one of the kids, essentially, where 80% they might keep for themselves, and then 20% would go straight into the family business and basically would pay everything else. So family business, 20%, 80 might belong to the kids, or depending how it's divided, sometimes it's 80-20, 60-40. It really depends on what the arrangement is, because the easiest one that I could remember is the 80-20. That is essentially the one that I went with. I'm not sure if that's the Pacific one that they follow, but from then on this is the one that we're going to go with for now. If something changes, or if I feel like that might not be completely accurate, I will possibly use other models such as maybe the 60-40, 70-30. It really depends. So this is to be considered for essentially Illumi's current assets. And as for non-current, here's the part that, it's the hardest, and we're going to talk about actually right now. So non-current for Illumi is a little bit difficult. Only because, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any properties that he specifically owns that is outside of the family name. So anything that's like independently owned, I don't think, keyword, think it exists. So if essentially he's not under the Zoldyck house, then he's under his fiance's home, and everything essentially along that line is within his fiance's name. And if that is the case, what I believe is happening is either it's under specifically his fiance's name, or that's it, or it's a combined joint thing. And for that, I think we would probably have to analyze that within, again, Hisoka's analysis, because I think it more so leans towards him. So as for non-current assets, I left it blank because as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any. And I don't think cars count as an asset either. So there's that. And also, again, not sure if the car is under the family's name or independently owned. That is more so questionable. So that's why I left it blank. again, don't get me wrong, this character and his fiance are both wealthy in their own right. This is not a, admonishment. Yeah, this is not me diminishing this character's wealth or anything. Trust me, they are very wealthy, okay? I'm just saying, as far as personal, non-current assets that might be owned, as far as I'm aware, I don't see any that's like in his name specifically. Anything that you think might be in his name, I think it's under like just his family's name, aka his dad's name. So as far as like independent property goes, I'm not sure. I'm leaving it blank. For now, it's just like it does not exist until there's evidence that proves otherwise. It is what it is, you know what I mean? And I think also going back to what I said before about the dysfunctional family, see how everything kind of connects together? I think that more so makes sense considering they're in a highly controlled family. Now that I think about it, them not having property that's specifically for them and they own it outside of the family, it's like that makes more sense given the family that we are dealing with when we talked about the dysfunctional family and dysfunctional family roles. So if we talked about before, we mentioned before in that one how they are essentially a narcissistic family model. And anytime you're dealing with that kind of family model, you're dealing within a model of like heavy control. So having any form of independence and semblance is not heavily encouraged, right? Everything is underneath one person's name, that being the patriarch of the family. I have very heavy doubts as for like the non-current asset due to those factors in mind. See how everything's kind of click-clacking together? Yeah, so with all that in mind, as far as like that non-current assets, it's safe to say that might not be happening, but that is okay because I think for this couple, their finances are essentially combined, and I'll talk more about that in part 3 and 4. So that's not really much of a concern to me. And I think that essentially is everything for today's episode for salary and assets, which concludes the Illumi portion of the economic partnership analysis. And again, this is not the complete end, because when we get into Hisoka's analysis, that is when we'll open up parts 3 and 4, and if I have to, part 5. So we're going to dive a bit more deeper into it, but this is just kind of concluding everything that we talked about and kind of diving a bit more deep into what goes inside a prenup. There are other things that go inside a prenup, anything that includes essentially child payment divisions, potentially child support, anything like that is going to go into also my Hisoillu parenting analysis. So like what they might be like as parents. So because of that in mind, there are certain things that I didn't talk about today that I will talk about in that analysis as well. I don't know when that one is coming out. I think that might be coming out a little bit after we're done with the next analyzations, which are like essentially parentification and me essentially predicting what this character could do next. So after I'm done with that, after the parentification and basically me concluding and me being like, what could this character do next? What does their future potentially look like? We are definitely going to continue on with like the future and all this other stuff a little bit later, right before we get into the entirety of Hisoka's analysis. So essentially stay tuned for that, because that's really going to be a roller coaster of a ride when we get to his fiance's analyzation. So the next episodes are pertaining to parentification and elder daughter/sibling syndrome. So just stay tuned for those, because those are going to be a roller coaster in and of itself. I know today's episode was pretty short, but I hope you enjoyed it regardless. And yeah, I will see you guys next time.